תודה. אז עכשיו כשכולנו באמת כאן, אני מזמינה את כל מי שקיבלו אוזניות לתרגום הסימולטני להתחבר. אנחנו יודעים איך עושים את זה? צריך הסבר? And our next guest really needs no introduction, but I still will introduce him with great, great pleasure. So the keynote speaker and the person, as I said, around whom we've convened is Professor Richard Dייוידסון, who kindly accepted our invitation and joined us here tonight, especially for this conference in Israel. Richard Dייוידסון is a professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds. He is a pioneer of the field of contemplative neuroscience, and his groundbreaking research, you probably all know actually, all of the photos of monks wearing the funny helmets with the electrodes. He's actually one of the first people, or the first person to ever research the effects of very deep and long-term meditation. And today, a few decades later, there's a lot of research in this field, but it's really all thanks to his initiation. And it's a body of research that I can also say that our nonprofit is really has benefited from a lot, like standing on the shoulder of giants. So we have one serious giant over here, and we are so very lucky to have him with us tonight. Richie is a devoted practitioner himself and a dear friend and confidant of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and one of Times Magazine 100 most influential people in the world for 2006, and that's thanks to his groundbreaking research, but not only that, but his devotion to implementing the research in real world for the benefit of humanity. So I don't want to take any more of your time. Thank you so much for being here. Please welcome Richie Dייוידסון.
So it's wonderful to be here, and I want to begin by just expressing my deepest appreciation and gratitude to Maria, who not only has been gracious and so enormously helpful, but who embodies all of the qualities that we're talking about and has been just such a delight to work with. And although this was my first occasion to meet her in person, I knew simply from the email interactions that we really were had a heart-to-heart connection. And so it's really been beautiful to work with you, and thank you for all you've done. I know I've organized events like this myself. I know what it takes, and you've done it with grace, so thank you. And thank you to Ricardo, who has been at the core of this invitation, and it's been really such a pleasure to spend time and learn more about the amazing work that is going on here. And to my dearest friend and colleague, Nava Levit Binun, who is a professor at Reichman University, and my last trip to Israel, which was 9 years ago now, was at the invitation of Nava, which began a friendship and a partnership that will continue, and I feel like I know that Nava, you're not just a colleague, but a Dharma sister, and I love you dearly, and thank you for everything. So if we can switch the slides to my Mac, I know this has been a source of a little trouble tonight, but that would be great. And so I don't know who's responsible for the switch, but if we can do that, please do it. But I can talk without slides too. So if we don't have the slides, it's totally fine. Okay, I'll let you try. That's it. Perfect. Thank you. So I am a psychologist and a neuroscientist by training, and I have been led to a really simple but radical conclusion from 35 years of research. I don't know what just happened, but this is actually a lecture on impermanence. I don't know. We need you again, Mariah. Up, there we go. Okay. I think we're returning here. So, in any case, so the radical and simple conclusion that we've been led to is that flourishing and well-being are best regarded as skills that can be cultivated through training. The idea that well-being and flourishing are skills is really so fundamental to this work and arises from our neuroscientific understanding that the mechanisms that support well-being in the brain are mechanisms that exhibit plasticity. They can change in response to experience and in response to training. In the early part of my career, I focused a lot on adversity, on the brain mechanisms that were responsible for anxiety and depression and stress-related disorders. And in 1992, I first met His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and in that meeting, he asked me why I can't use the tools of modern science that I've been using to study stress and anxiety and depression and use them to study kindness and to study compassion. And I didn't have a very good answer for His Holiness on that day, other than that it's hard. But it was hard when we began this work on adversity, and I think we've made at least a little bit of progress. So I've had the pleasure and honor of spending quite a bit of time with the Dalai Lama over the last 30 years. And before COVID, I would see him 3 or 4 times a year. And just this past October, was with him for 3 weeks, the first time I had seen him since COVID. And he was so clear and so singularly focused on the message of our common humanity. His Holiness reminded us that borders are arbitrary, that language is arbitrary, that what is important for us to recognize is that every human being shares the same capacity to flourish, and we would go even further to say has a right to flourish. And so this is the inspiration that led to the development of our Center for Healthy Minds and all the work we did over the last 35 years. One of the important messages that I'd like to share at the beginning of this presentation is one that really doesn't need, you going to fix this? Ah, there, it's on. It's good. Don't touch. Up. You can plug that in here. Maybe this VGA? Is this the same? Okay, very good. Thank you. Toda rabah. So I don't think that a long monologue on how difficult a situation we face today in many different parts of the world to underscore the fact that our well-being really is in rapid decline. But just a little data point from Israel. This is a recent paper which I think is about to come out, or maybe it's just recently appeared, and this is comparing rates of depression and anxiety in adolescents pre-COVID and during COVID. And it's just to underscore that the pandemic has made what is a really challenging situation even worse. And I want to call your attention to one thing in particular here, and that is this data point that I've circled, which is adolescent girls. And it's showing an enormous increase in rates of depression here in Israel during COVID compared to pre-COVID, and the consequences of this are devastating. And so we really need to take this into account in our efforts to develop interventions on a widespread scale. And one of the things that is important to remind us is that our well-being matters. And here's just one data point to underscore that fact. This is a study looking at the relation between well-being and a very important distal outcome, which is longevity. And it is looking at the relation between well-being and longevity across 151 countries in the world. And what it shows is that in countries in whom the population is reporting higher levels of well-being, people live longer. So this is kind of the ultimate outcome measure, if you will. And these data are part of a whole cottage industry of research that shows that our well-being is importantly tied to our physical health. People who report higher levels of well-being are physically healthier. It doesn't mean that that's true of everyone, but if we look at a large population, that is what we find. And it leads to the important conjecture that cultivating well-being will not only lead to higher levels of well-being, but it will also lead to improvements in our physical health. Now, all of the work on depression and anxiety, and I haven't shown data on suicide rates, but it's in most parts of the world really challenging, gotten worse over the last few years. I bring this slide to you to remind us that when things were really terrible in the United States at the height of the civil rights era in the 1960s, this is a photograph of the famous speech that Martin Luther King gave in Washington, D.C. The title of this speech was not, "I Have a Nightmare." I have a dream. And having a dream about a different way of living, a different mode of being, is so critically important in guiding us to nurture our well-being and to promote human flourishing. Now, I want to introduce you to another person. This happens to be a good friend of mine, probably not known to any of you, but someone important in mental health in the world. He was the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States, which is the single largest funding agency for mental health and psychiatric research in the world. And he was director for 13 years, and he has retired from that position about 6 years ago. And I'd like to read you a quote from an interview he did about 2 years ago after he had retired from his position. He said, "I spent 13 years at NIMH, which is the National Institute of Mental Health in the US, really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realize that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion US, I don't think we move the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that." Now, this is spoken by one of the world's leading neuroscientists and geneticists. And as a neuroscientist myself, I strongly resonate with this view. And I must tell you a little personal anecdote. When we published our first paper on long-term meditation practitioners, it came out in 2004, and it was published in a very prestigious scientific journal. And I ran into Tom Insel, who was a friend, is a friend, at a scientific meeting about 6 months after that paper got published, and he pulled me aside and he said, "Richie, why are you wasting your time on that stuff? We need you to do other kinds of research." And then fast forward 10 years later, in Davos, Switzerland, at the World Economic Forum, Tom and I were together in a dialogue about the value of mindfulness as an important modality in treating mental disorders. So this is, to me, astounding progress as a scientist to see that kind of change in such really a short period of time. And one of the important lessons from this is that today, and this may sound a little bit unusual, particularly coming from a neuroscientist, but the most effective strategy for influencing complex neural circuits in the brain is, in fact, non-pharmacological behavioral interventions like meditation. That through those kinds of mental exercises, we can actually produce more specific biological change than we can through any known pharmaceutical. So this is something, and the side effect profile is much better. Very few side effects. Not none, but very few. So, to go back to our earlier discussion that well-being is a skill that can be learned in a way that's fundamentally no different than learning to play the violin or learning a complex sport. Now, here is an important opportunity for me to introduce a distinction that we have gleaned from modern neuroscience that's so important to this work. And it's a distinction between two fundamentally different kinds of learning. One kind of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about stuff, conceptual learning. This university and most universities in the world are pillars of declarative learning. Most of the learning that goes on at the university is declarative learning. Now, we know we can learn the value of kindness. We can learn the value of honesty. But does that make us a kind or an honest person? There's another form of learning that is absolutely necessary. And we call that procedural learning. Procedural learning is skill-based. It is acquired through practice, and it is instantiated in completely different brain systems than declarative learning. And to produce enduring change, we need both. So in order to learn the skills of compassion, the skills of kindness, you can't just read a book or attend a lecture. You've got to practice. And so the practice component is the declarative learning piece. And curricula that bring both together are the kind of curricula that will produce enduring change. And one of the wonderful experiences I had on this visit to Israel has been to visit two schools, one in Lod and one in Gan. Okay. Close to here, not too far. And these are schools where there's such inspiring work going on that is led by many of the people in this room who are really bringing these two kinds of learning together in an integrated way. And this is just gives me such hope for the future and for the next generation. The same mechanisms that are responsible for, and we can say that encode suffering and trauma, are the very same mechanisms that we can harness for awakening, for flourishing. And those are basic mechanisms of plasticity. One is neuroplasticity, which refers to the notion that the brain can change in response to experience and training. And the other is epigenetics. And epigenetics is the science of how our genes are regulated. So we all have a sequence of base pairs that constitute our DNA. And for the most part, that sequence will not change over the course of our lives. But what will change is the extent to which any gene is turned on or turned off. And that is what epigenetics is about. And we know that experience, we know that environmental conditions can modulate our epigenetics and change our gene expression. And we now know that simple forms of meditation, as the kind that Matti led us so beautifully in when we first began, those kinds of practices can actually change our epigenetics. And we've learned from modern science over the last few years, very new stuff, that epigenetic changes can actually be passed down at least one or two generations. And I know this sounds Lamarckian and kind of science fiction-y, but this is actual real science published in the best scientific journals in the world. We're now doing research in our center where we're training using strategies to cultivate well-being. We're training pregnant women, and we're looking at the outcomes in their fetus, in their baby, both before they're born and then after they're born. And when the babies are born, we actually can extract blood from the umbilical cord, and we can get an epigenetic snapshot of the fetus. And through that, we can actually track the epigenetic changes that are induced by training that occurs during pregnancy that can be passed down to the next generation. And so this is something we know now is real. And there's a lot of talk about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And we're now talking about the intergenerational transmission of flourishing. Okay, so what contributes to resilience and flourishing? And here I want to introduce you briefly to a framework that we've developed in our center that is at the heart of so much of what we're doing today. And this is a framework that describes 4 key pillars of well-being. And this was published in an article that appeared a couple of years ago called The Plasticity of Well-Being. So what are these 4 pillars? The first pillar is awareness. And awareness includes mindfulness. It includes our capacity to focus our attention. And it includes a capacity that scientists call meta-awareness. And meta-awareness refers to knowing what your mind is doing. How many of you think you know what your mind is doing? Raise your hand. Wow, none of you know what your mind is doing? A few, okay. How many of you have ever had the experience of reading a book where you read each word on a page, and you read one page, maybe a second page, and after a few minutes you have no idea what you've just read. Your mind is somewhere else. Okay, but we wake up, we discover, we recognize that we're lost. And that moment is a moment of meta-awareness. And it turns out that meta-awareness is actually a skill. It can be trained. You can improve it. And meta-awareness, we believe, is really fundamental. Because if you don't know what your mind is doing, how can you change it? And so bringing meta-awareness is really important for all other forms of transformation. The second pillar is connection. Connection is about qualities that are important for our healthy social relationships. Qualities like gratitude, kindness, appreciation, empathy, compassion. These are all the qualities that are the glue of our social connectivity. And we know that increased social connection is a critical ingredient for well-being. The Dalai Lama always reminds us that the expression of kindness and compassion to others is the most direct route to our happiness and well-being. The third pillar is insight. And insight refers to a curiosity-driven self-knowledge, and literally knowledge of the narrative of ourselves. We all have this narrative in our head about who we are. And at the extreme end of a distribution, there are people who have a very negative narrative. They have negative beliefs and negative expectations of themselves. And of course, we know that's a prescription for depression. And we also know that one of the key elements of well-being is not so much initially to change the narrative, but it is to change our relationship to the narrative so that we can recognize this narrative for what it is. It's a set of beliefs, it's a set of thoughts. And that helps to give us some distance from these beliefs and expectations and loosen their grip on our perception and our attention. And finally, the last pillar of well-being is purpose. Purpose is about finding our sense of direction in life. And it's not so much about finding something more purposeful to do, but how can we find meaning and purpose in that which we are already doing, including the pedestrian activities of our daily life? Can taking out the garbage be deeply connected to your sense of purpose? Can washing the dishes be deeply connected to your sense of purpose? And of course it could be. Everything could be. And it just requires a little bit of reframing. So I want to now take a deeper dive into each of these 4 pillars. I'm going to go through some of this really briefly because of limitations of time. And Ricardo, if you or Morea can just tell me when I have 5 minutes left, it would be good. Okay, so this dude on the right is William James. He is the father of American psychology, someone who has been very influential in my career. I was a graduate student in William James Hall, and I was not assigned a single page of William James to read as a graduate student, but fortunately I found his work on my own, and he wrote a 2-volume tome in 1890 called The Principles of Psychology. And he has a chapter on it that's called Attention in this 2-volume tome, and it's really a remarkable piece of work. And I want to read you one little paragraph from this chapter. William James said, "The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about." And the italics are in the original William James. This is a remarkable passage. And if William James had more familiarity with the contemplative traditions that we study today, I think he would have instantaneously seen that these are methods to actually educate attention. And attention is the building block for all other forms of learning. The fact that we don't systematically educate attention in our children is nothing short of a moral failing. This is something we really need to do, particularly in light of the pernicious influence of social media on our kids' behavior. This came up in the workshop that we just had. If our children were better regulators of their attention, we would, I think, be able to, in a preventative way, significantly decrease the negative impact of the media to which they are exposed. So this is something really important. And we've studied this in many different ways, but one of the ways we've studied it, and this is one of the pictures that I think Mariah was referring to earlier, this actually is a picture of a very famous young Tibetan Lama who is someone that has taught me much of what I know about meditation. His name is Mingyur Rinpoche, and he has been very gracious with his time and has spent countless hours in our laboratory being studied. And this is actually a photograph from the first time he was in our lab, which was in 2002. And when we recorded his brain during meditation, we saw something quite remarkable. And what we decided to study these long-term practitioners because if we didn't see anything unusual in their brains, then the study of novice practitioners would likely not be very fruitful. So we wanted to start with these very long-term practitioners. And so we did that, and this is a slide from the 2004 paper that illustrates these high amplitude gamma oscillations. Gamma is a specific frequency of brain electrical activity. And the amazing thing is that you can see on this slide a period where there's just resting and then during meditation, and you can visibly see that there's a difference. You don't need a computer doing fancy signal processing to show that there's a difference. It's very rare when we do research with these crude brain electrical measures that are recorded from the scalp surface. It's exceedingly rare that you actually can see something with the naked eye like this in a raw recording. Almost never do we see it. And so when we first saw it, we thought that it was an artifact. And we literally spent a year doing all kinds of control experiments to convince ourselves and to convince scientific reviewers that we were seeing something real. And so this was the beginning of the journey. And these gamma oscillations have been linked to features of attention, which have been finely honed in these long-term practitioners, and is also a marker of a certain kind of insight, because we not only see that these gamma oscillations are increased in their amplitude, but they're also highly synchronized across many different brain regions. And this is a neural signature of the integration of these many different brain systems, which has been associated with certain kinds of insight. So I want to say a little bit about connection now and share with you findings now going in the opposite direction with people who are just learning to practice, who've never done any meditation, and they were signing up for a study on strategies to promote well-being. And we randomly assigned people to a group where they were taught a simple compassion practice that involved bringing into their mind and their heart different categories of people and envisioning a time in their life when they may have had some difficulty, and then genuinely, in a very sincere way, forming the aspiration that they be relieved of that suffering, of that difficulty. And they use simple phrases to help them reinforce this aspiration. And they did this for a loved one, for themselves, for a person they don't know very well. And then they did it for a class of people that Mingyur Rinpoche, in his book, The Joy of Living, says is 100 times more effective than doing this for a loved one. And that is for a difficult person, someone who pushes your buttons. Maybe not the most extremely difficult person, but someone who is challenging. And bring them into your mind and your heart. And even if you don't know them well, envision a time in their life when they may have been suffering, and then cultivate that aspiration that they be relieved of suffering. The control group in this study was assigned to receive training derived from cognitive therapy, which is really one of the most empirically well-validated strategies for decreasing depression and anxiety and improving well-being. And in this study, we also tried to use a sort of hard-nosed behavioral measure of the effects of compassion. And one of the things that we reasoned is that people who go through compassion training should behave more altruistically. And so we used a task where we can get a really good, scientifically hard-nosed measure of altruism. And it would take a long time to explain the details of this task, but it's derived from the field of behavioral and neuroeconomics. And it involves using real money substantial amounts of real money to give up so that another transaction can be more fair. So that's all I'll say about that. But let me show you that this is after just 2 weeks of compassion training, where they were practicing for 30 minutes a day for 2 weeks, a total of 7 hours. The people who were randomly assigned to the compassion group in green are behaving more altruistically compared to their counterparts who received the cognitive training, cognitive reappraisal training that came from cognitive therapy. Now, what was really cool about this is we put people in the scanner before and after this 2 weeks of training, and what we found is that the changes that we see in altruism actually predicted the changes that occurred in the brain. And so people who showed a specific change in the brain that involves centers that are important in certain kinds of positive emotion and also in goal-directed behavior, that people who showed a bigger change in the brain behaved more altruistically among the folks who were assigned to the compassion group. So these data are really a proof of concept, and they show that really small amounts of training, in this case it's a total of 7 hours among ranked beginners, is sufficient to produce a change in an objective measure of behavior and in the brain. And it doesn't mean that these changes will endure. We think they'll only endure if we continue to practice, but they illustrate that it doesn't take much to get these circuits going, because we are born to be kind. We are born to be compassionate. We are born to flourish. We have within us the capacity, and what we simply need to do is to nurture those innate capacities. More recently, and this is something I'll just show you very, very quickly, it's just been published, we find that when we do this kind of training in teachers, one of the big problems in the United States is a gap in academic achievement between black and white students, and that gap is largely driven by bias. And it's not explicit bias. I mean, 99% of teachers say they're not biased at all. But if we test them on measures of implicit bias, we see that they are biased. And so we ask the question, does training in compassion and in basic mindfulness together, bringing them together, does that help reduce, again, hard-nosed behavioral measures of implicit bias? And we see that it does, and that these changes are preserved at 6 months following the end of the formal intervention. So it's not only showing that we can produce these changes, but we can produce them and have them endure. And this is actually the longest duration of preservation of a reduction in implicit bias that we know of, that's been shown using rigorous experimental methods. And so this kind of compassion training really can matter in situations that have real-world consequences. So a little bit about insight. One of the key attributes that is altered by insight is resilience. And the reason that is because when we are identified in a very fixed way with our image of ourselves, with our concept of ourselves, we hold on to emotions. We hold on to emotions for a duration that is longer than is needed. And this really is toxic when the emotions are negative emotions. And so one of the ways we think about resilience is that resilience is the rapidity with which we recover from adversity, at least in part. So let me illustrate this. Imagine, and this is hypothetical, imagine that this is a person who is exposed to some stressful life experience at this time point 3, roughly, and you can measure anything you want. You can measure changes in their stress hormones like cortisol. You can measure changes in activation in the amygdala in the brain. You can measure changes in their heart rate. We have looked at this in multiple systems, and the basic patterns are present in all of these different systems. So let's just contrast this person with a second person, person B, who responds with the same amplitude but comes back down to baseline much more quickly. So person B is exposed to the same stress but is recovering more quickly. And we would say that person B is more resilient compared to person A. So let's ask now what effect training in insight has on this measure in actual people. So one of the ways we do this is we use physical pain. So we have utilized many different ways to safely and ethically torture people in the laboratory. And more seriously, you know, when you go to a cardiologist and you have your heart assessed, you often do what's called a cardiac stress test, where the heart is challenged. And what we're doing here is challenging the mind and the brain. And we can do that in safe ways. And the way we do it in the laboratory with pain is with heat. And we can deliver heat very precisely and very safely. And I've had it done to myself many, many times. And it's extremely real because it's real heat. For that reason, it's very ecologically valid. So I want to show you the results of a very simple experiment that we did, where we brought non-meditators and long-term meditators into the lab, and we gave them this really painful heat. And we gave them one example of it before the experiment started. Then we brought them into the scanner. And the experiment was very simple. We tell them that when you hear a tone of a certain pitch, beep, 10 seconds later, you're going to get zapped with this intense pain. That's the experiment. So let me show you what happens. We bring non-meditators into the laboratory. And I should say one more thing, and that is the study of the brain circuits that respond to physical pain have been well characterized. So we know exactly where to look in the brain. So we have the non-meditators come in, and we present the tone to them, and we're looking in the areas of the brain that are pain responsive, and all we've presented to them is beep, and their brain is on fire. Their brain responds as if it actually got the heat stimulus, even though nothing happened other than the tone. Then they continue to respond, and they have a very slow recovery. Now let's see what the long-term meditators show. They come in, they hear the tone, nothing. There's actually no significant activation in any area of the pain matrix, none. Absolutely flat. Then when the painful heat comes on, they show a huge response. And actually in some areas of the brain, it's significantly larger than the non-meditators, larger. And then when the painful stimulus goes off, they come right back down to baseline. This is the neural signature of resilience. And this can be learned. Okay, I'm going to skip this in the interest of time, but let me just say one thing about this, and this is just another pain experiment, and it shows that we calculated the number of hours of practice in long-term practitioners and how it relates to changes in the brain, and the important message here is that it's only retreat practice that actually predicts changes in the brain. This is just, as I said in the workshop before, this is a public service announcement. Please go on retreat. It's beneficial for your brain. Okay, just a little bit about purpose. I'll just say one thing here about purpose. This is looking at on the y-axis is the cumulative hazard ratio for death. And it's looking at people who are 70 years and older and following them longitudinally. And the single most important psychological predictor of longevity among people who are 70 years and older is purpose in life. That is the single most important psychological predictor of longevity. People who report higher levels of purpose that you see in this slide, who are in the 90th percentile, the dotted line, are much less likely to die over the course of this period compared to people in the 10th percentile, the lowest decile in their reports of purpose in life. So purpose in life really matters. Okay. The microdosing of well-being. This is not about giving drugs, but it's about sprinkling throughout our daily lives reminders to appreciate, to be kind, to express gratitude. The little nooks and crannies of our everyday life where we can help to remind people to familiarize them with these basic qualities of our mind. This is something that we believe can be done. It's where technology can potentially be useful, and we have a lot going on around this. And it is in part being done through our Healthy Minds program. This is our Healthy Minds program app. It is available in Israel. It's totally free. It's the only meditation app that is freely available and is scientifically based. There are 2 randomized controlled trials that have been published, and it incorporates all 4 of our pillars of well-being. So it's not just mindfulness. It's not a mindfulness app. It is a human flourishing app. And it has all of the different elements that I've talked about. So please try it. We'd love to have it translated into Hebrew and Arabic, and we'll see if we can make that happen. You can learn more about it by going to that website. And this is just some data from the randomized controlled trials, which I won't bore you with, but they've been published. I want to just bring your attention to one data point, which happens to be, we think, really important. This is from a study that hasn't yet been published, but will be published very soon. It was done with school teachers. We did this study pre-COVID. The teachers were trained in our well-being program, and we followed them during COVID. These were public school K through 12 teachers in the United States. And we simply asked, among the teachers that were randomly assigned to receive our well-being training, how many of them are still teaching today? And what we found is that the teachers who went through our well-being training were 6 times more likely, compared to their randomly assigned counterparts, to still be teaching. And we calculated, just based on the retention data alone, for every $1 invested in the intervention, there was a $3.34 return on that investment within 3 years. So well-being matters. And it's an urgent public health need. So I want to encourage you to request that you be all part of the journey. Every one of us has a role to play. When human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth, and I'll bet everyone in the audience brushes your teeth. If we spent even as short a time as we spend brushing our teeth, nourishing our mind every day, this world would be a different place. So let's take this, bring this out, spread it to all your friends and colleagues, And if we nourish our mind, we can indeed change the world. Let me end with a quote from the Dalai Lama. The systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation, by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental traits and challenging negative mental traits, is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. Thank you very much.
Not enough words to say thank you, and hopefully enough energy and fuel to have us all increasing the microdosing of our well-being.